and just prepare ourselves, shall we? Father God, we thank you for your word. Father, we thank you that we don't have to look far to hear your voice and to learn, what it is that you would want from us, what it is to be your children, to be those who follow you, who live in light of your love. Lord, we thank you that we don't have to go on a long quest to find that, but Lord, it's very close by us. Lord, I pray that you might speak to us through your word this morning. I pray that you might speak through me, and that, Lord, you might shape us and mould us into your image, into all that you've made us to be. Lord, might you speak to us this morning. Help us, Lord, as we want to worship you now by listening to your word and by opening ourselves to hear your voice this morning. Pray that you would be with us now in this time. Amen. I want to share with you the lyrics of a song. This is from the movie Tangled. I don't know if you sort of might have pegged my sort of movie taste as being sort of only in one genre, but this is from the kids' movie Tangled, from a character called Eugene. He learns that actually he's the prince of a dark kingdom, and he sings this song, and the lyrics are amazing. He says, "I thought I was an outcast. I thought I stood alone, a rogue, a thief, a joker, no place to call my own. I thought no one could love me, and how could I have known? I was wrong, oh so wrong. Then I thought I found it, a dream I could share. I thought I was so lucky, it almost wasn't fair. I thought I knew my purpose, I thought I knew where I belong, but I was wrong. Everything I ever thought I knew, where I've been, where I'm going, everything I counted on turned out to be untrue. Could have guessed, should have known. Everything I ever thought I knew was a lie." You can realize this in a negative way in life. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. Or actually, you can realize everything I thought I knew was a lie and it be an incredibly positive thing. Tim Keller says this about the gospel. He says, "The gospel is this, that we are more sinful and flawed than we ever dared believe. Everything we thought that we knew was a lie. We're much more sinful, much more flawed than we could have ever thought or imagined." But he says, yet at the same time, we are more loved than we ever dared hope. Everything I ever thought I knew was a lie, because we're more loved than we ever wrote ourselves off as not being able to be. Christians have first and foremost realized that everything we once thought we knew was a lie. And so now we're relearning life. And that's what it is to be a disciple of Jesus. And that's the language that Jesus uses here. That we're called to this lifelong journey of relearning everything we thought that we knew. That's our mission, is to make disciples, to make learners of Jesus. But the mission happens whilst we are becoming disciples ourselves. What if we come to realize that all of our life was about relearning everything we thought we once knew through Jesus? That's really the theme and the idea of today, is that we are learners together. That all of our life is to be shaped by and marked by this journey of relearning everything in light of Jesus's love. The first thing we see in these verses actually is the bit that isn't said, but is probably important to say, is the prerequisite, is the foundation of Jesus giving this mission here to his close friends, the disciples here. And that is that actually we're called to everyday discipleship ourselves. So that every day is a school day. The mission here is not only make disciples, but of course actually it's to be disciples who make disciples. It's worth saying that really that's the basis on which this all hinges and happens, is that these 11 already were disciples. And yet there's an important thing to see there, even in those first verses there, which are the 11 go to the mountain. Jesus has worked closely with only 12 people, and one of those has betrayed him and has walked away and made ruin of his life. But those 11 have followed Jesus. They've seen the signs that Jesus has performed, the miraculous works that pointed to who he was. We've seen a bit of that in our sort of first foray into John's Gospel. We'll come back to John's Gospel eventually. But we've seen that, and we've seen how also he's been revealed in his teaching in moments where he's explained who he is too. And the disciples have not only had the public sort of teaching and ministry of Jesus, because they've also had the explanation of what the parables have meant as well, that Jesus doesn't give to the crowds in the same way. Jesus is deeply ministered to, deeply served, deeply taught these 11, a small number of people in a very intentional and very in-depth manner. And the first thing actually to observe, I think, there is to say, on the other hand, churches are so keen and so eager, I think, all too often, to try to reach as many people as possible with a very shallow teaching. Yet Jesus does the opposite. A very small number, comparatively, but with a very in-depth teaching. And not just in terms of, when I say in-depth, that's not just academic, is it? No, what I mean by that is that you see him day by day, discipling them, again and again, about everything to do with life. Jesus deeply ministers with a small number of people. He's taught them not primarily in a sort of classroom setting. These first learners here, these disciples, and the word disciple comes from the original Greek mathetes, from which we get the English word mathematics. It literally means student, pupil, learner. Someone who follows a master who teaches them. And he's taught them not primarily in a classroom, but in everyday life. And yet, again, it's important to recognize that all too often, again, where do we as churches tend to by default think that we're going to sort of make disciples? Well, doesn't it very often revert kind of to a classroom? Come to this class and be told by one, maybe two or three people, here's what you need to know, here's what you need to do. Jesus doesn't teach people in a classroom setting, he teaches them in everyday life. And they've seen his whole manner of life and how the reality of who he is and what he's doing comes to bear on everything in life. Can't reduce being a disciple of Jesus only to a course. Courses can help as well, of course, because sometimes there are some things, you kind of need to know that help along the way, of course. But you can't reduce it to only that, because it's a way of life. Two primary ways that the church, that Christians are given this sort of identity in the New Testament of being learners of Jesus. Firstly is the use of that word disciples, and it's used frequently just of the church rather than the word church, just the disciples in a certain city. At least 88 times it's used in that context, as well as being used to speak of individual Christians as well. But the other way, and this is what happens really, I guess, in the very earliest days of the church, where honestly people are trying to work out what's going on. What do we call ourselves? And what do we call them? Is that they were often just simply called followers of the way. Because it was the best sort of thing that people could come up with to describe what they were about. And the two words between them carry the two important meanings. One, we're learners, that's great. But what are we learning? Is it just sort of information? Well, no, actually the other word here really helps us, because it tells us it's a way of life. It's about all of life. It's about everyday life. John, one of Jesus' closest friends, in his first letter, introduces it by saying, and this to paraphrase him because my memory's not very good, but he says words to the effect of, what we're telling you here is not just some story. We're telling you what we've seen, what we've heard, what we've touched, what we've seen with our eyes, what we heard with our ears, what we've lived alongside. What he's trying to say is, we're giving you an eyewitness account. We're telling you what really happened. This isn't a myth. This isn't a cleverly devised kind of story. We're telling you just what happened, what we lived through. And yet, like we said, the disciples are also given this explanation of Jesus' teaching, especially his parables as well. We learn that in Matthew chapter 13. Jesus is intentionally focused on teaching a very small crowd, really, in great depth. He hasn't sought a huge crowd with a shallow teaching. In fact, actually, you actively see Jesus avoiding bigger crowds. You see him saying, oh, there's a great crowd gathering, and Jesus departed and went off. Them saying, Jesus, you have to go to this town because all these people want you here. And he said, no, we're going to go to this town. Of Jesus turning to his crowd after having fed the 5,000 and saying, you're only following me because of the bread. If you want to go, go. He's not interested in just creating a huge crowd of very fickle sort of followers. The kind of followers we have on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and everything else where, they're kind of following the posts and stuff to keep up with the gossip. But, we're not really friends. Jesus isn't interested. He wants a small crowd who he's going to teach in great depth. And a huge element of this teaching, the apostles, the first disciples who go out and share this message and plant churches and make disciples, recognize this idea of doing sort of discipleship and learning Jesus in everyday life is really important. Listen to these few verses here. I'm going to just try and pick my Bible up here. From 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7. Paul says this, he says, we were gentle among you, like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were ready to share with you not only the gospel of God, but also our own selves, because you have become very dear to us. For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We work night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. Do you see that they connect the two ideas, that to be someone who makes disciples is not just about teaching a content, but it is sharing a way of life with them too. That's a crucial element. And the real underpinning and foundation of Jesus giving this mission to his disciples here is the reality that they already are those who are journeying into this lifelong thing of learning all of life through the light of the gospel. The mission Jesus gives comes out of the identity that we have, that we've already been given, that we are the followers of Christ, his learners. So we're to go out and to pursue that journey of relearning everything in him and helping others too. So everyday discipleship sort of underpins the whole idea here. But secondly, and this might in a strange way be some sort of source of encouragement to you in a few moments, is that there's some underwhelming preliminary results for them. If I can get this up here, I might be able to share with you a couple of funny products here, some underwhelming products that didn't quite live up to the hopes of the sort of inventors. The first one we've got here, if I can get it on, there we go. Hopefully you can see that there. I don't know, can you see that? Yeah, okay. I can't tell because on my screen I still see me, and I'm very easily confused. The first product here, these were crisps that in 1998 were marketed as fat-free crisps. A great example of the truism and the general sort of parable that if something is too good to be true, it really probably is. But they marketed these as, here are all the same kind of crisp flavors, but none of the fat. So you don't have to kind of feel guilty afterwards. You don't have to worry about how many you eat, except that the fat replacement they use, called I think it's Alestra, caused quite serious cramping, what could best be described as incontinence, and other significant digestive problems. It turned out that there were some quite underwhelming results to what had promised so much. Secondly, some of you may possibly be able to remember this, but in 1985, Coca-Cola decided that their sort of market domination wasn't quite enough as they were, that they needed to reinvent Coke. And so they came up with New Coke. And they hoped that this would sort of take them into a new generation. And yet, there were disappointing results. It led to public protests, boycotts of the product, and even some bottles being sort of ceremonially sort of dumped out in the street in sort of disgust at the new flavour. And a rather unfortunate tagline considering all that America's taste just got better. The market said otherwise. Well, how about this? This is one of the first ever digital cameras called the Apple QuickTake from 1994. At the time, absolutely groundbreaking. It sounds awful now, but a 0.3 megapixel camera. At the time, that was very, very good, but now that just sounds embarrassing. It had no focus, no zoom, and oddly enough, no preview of the photograph you'd taken. So no idea as to whether it was even any good at the end of it. And you could store an almighty 8 photographs on there. And your sort of only way of getting them was to also have a computer that you could then sort of get them into. But as far as I can remember, in 1994, sort of printers that would sort of print you out photographs from your computer were not that great. Understandably, pretty underwhelming results for it. Or how about this last one here? You've tried the toothpaste, so why not try the microwave meals? At some point, Colgate released a range of kitchen entrees, which, yeah, understandably, it was a difficult sell to convince people to buy food from the people who give you toothpaste. And so it really flopped. There's some products with completely underwhelming results. And for the disciples here, as great as Jesus is, as a teacher and role model, the results are underwhelming. It's certainly no reflection upon Jesus, but we see some of that here. Firstly, we've mentioned that one of the 12 has not only left, but, betrayed Jesus and had him killed. Pretty disappointing, I think it's safe to say. But we see here that even within those who are left, there's some relatively underwhelming performance going on through them. Verse 16 here, it tells us they went to the mountain, and there's a measure of obedience, which is great, because to this point, the male sort of disciples here have not believed the testimony of the women who first saw Jesus resurrected. In fact, it tells us in one of the gospel accounts that they refused to believe. They just wouldn't have it that he was alive. So it's amazing, actually, they do obey Jesus here, and they do come to the mountain to meet him by the message from the women. They meet him on the mountain, but verse 17 here, look at it, it says that they worshipped him, but some doubted. And look at that sort of balance between, on the one hand, there is some worship, and then there is some doubt too. Pretty half-hearted, pretty disappointing, really. I think. And actually, I think it gets worse when you think it tells us here in the English sort of translation that some doubted. Kind of makes it sound like you had some faithful, and then a few who are a bit kind of more skeptical, a bit harder to convince. Actually, the original Greek says something closer to there was some doubt. And I think that gets across really what is more likely happening, which is that probably every one of them doubted to an extent. They worshipped, but there was some doubt. They weren't fully convinced. And this, even though they have seen the resurrected Jesus at this point. Okay, so you might think that might sort of be the trigger and the thing that would sort of really get rid of your doubts. And yet still, there's a doubt in them. There's some underwhelming results for them here. Our learning might look quite underwhelming too. It might look at times quite half-hearted. We might be quite disappointed with ourselves at times as we think on that. And yet, and here's where the encouragement comes in, God is with them. Jesus is with them. Jesus doesn't give up on them. In fact, actually, quite mercifully, quite graciously, Jesus doesn't tell them off. I mean, he'd be quite within his rights to tell them off for the fact that they're pretty half-hearted at this point. They're still not convinced. But he doesn't. He doesn't give up on them. He's not thrown off by it. You know, the fact that we're called to be learners of Jesus, to relearn all of life in light of the gospel, isn't a call to perfectionism. So one of the things for you might be is, as we even begin to think about this, is you might be sort of, your mind and your heart might be going to that place and thinking, oh no, is this that thing where I'm just going to be exposed for sort of how far off I am? It's not a call for perfectionism. Look at his first disciples. It's very, very far from perfect. It's about increased dependence, not perfectionism. And hopefully that might be a great relief to you as you perhaps reflect on your own journey. And certainly for me, as I reflect on my journey, I think, pretty mediocre execution on it, really, and yet met with a grand evaluation from Jesus. Greatest example of this is Hebrews chapter 11. You have that great roll call of all these sort of memorable figures from Scripture. And these great sort of assessments of how they followed God in faith. And it's true because they did. They did believe in God and they did follow his commands. And yet, when you read the stories, you also know that it was met by a lot of doubt, a lot of slip-ups along the way. And the two things are true. That they did have faith. And that they are an example to follow. And yet, there's plenty of flaws. And there's plenty of problems and plenty of failings too. It's an encouragement to us that things might seem underwhelming, but it's not about perfectionism. It's about increased dependence on Jesus. We see some underwhelming results. But thirdly, we see here a call to multiplication. Sometimes I feel as though the idea of, speaking about everyday mission, and our mission being that each one of us, being a disciple, being a learner of Jesus, who goes out and lives that out in all of life and seeks to make disciples of others, almost needs a kind of defense, because it feels like, well, I don't know, should we have, a bit more of a program, a bit more of a sort of strategy, a bit more kind of dramatic kind of events and things like this. One of the really helpful things about COVID-19 is I think it really helps the thinking on this, because now we're all really sort of aware of the idea of R rates and the concept of exponential growth, that actually all it potentially takes for COVID-19 spread to really get out of hand is for that R rate to be at 1, that I could infect one other person potentially at this point, and everybody else on average will infect one other person if you're not careful in observing some of the guidelines on hand washing and face masks and everything else. We've suddenly become aware of that as a thing. And the exact same thing would work with discipleship. That if every one disciple made one disciple at a discipleship rate of 1, we would experience exponential growth. That's actually all it would take. So do we need a big fancy program, a big fancy sort of strategy? No, I don't think so, really. Jesus might well have known a little bit better than us after all. Perhaps the mathematics is now finally showing that Jesus knew what he was talking about after all. And there's a call to multiplication in it. If the mission is to make disciples, then discipleship is also the place where mission is done. So actually, oddly enough, the place that people who don't know Jesus yet come to know Jesus is the journey in which we're on of coming to learn who Jesus is, what he's done, who we are, and how we should live. So I don't have to get on a plane to be on mission. I'm already in a mission field. Leslie Newbigin, the British missionary, spent most of his life out in India, working with churches there, and then later in his life returned to the UK and is famous for observing that actually the UK had now become a mission field. He had left at the point where the idea was that missionaries needed to be sent out by the UK into other places in the world to help evangelize those places. And by the time he came back, he realized that no, actually the reality is home is now a mission field. In a famous article in 1987 called "Can the West Be Converted?" he says this: "Can there be an effective missionary encounter within this culture, this so powerful, persuasive, and confident culture, which at least until very recently simply regarded itself as the coming world civilization? Can the West be converted?" is what he asked. And it can, but it's not through a fancy program or a fancy strategy or flashy events. It's through the simple reality of disciples, being disciples, and making disciples in all of life. Why? Why can we say that? How can we be confident? Newbigin asks the question, and he's asking it, rhetorically. I think he knows that and believes that the answer is yes, though it might take some thought and work. But here's how we can have that confidence. Verse 18, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And before he gives that mission, he gives that status of himself. And that's significant. All authority is in heaven and earth has been given to me. All jurisdiction, all ability to make decisions, to have power has been given to me. Jesus' status defines our identity. Jesus has all authority. He is King of Kings. He is Lord of Lords. And so we are his followers. The fuel for mission, that mission of making disciples, isn't guilt. It isn't just simply to make people feel bad that, well, if you don't, then how are they going to come to know him? Albeit all of that is kind of true. But the fuel isn't a guilt trip. The fuel is a bigger vision of who Jesus is and his glory and his majesty and his grace and his love. The fuel isn't guilt. It's a bigger God. But notice here, verse 17, that doubt that the disciples have doesn't disqualify them. It doesn't mean now suddenly they're not able to do it. All authority in heaven and earth is given to Jesus, and because of that, they're not disqualified. But secondly, Jesus isn't deterred by their doubt. He isn't put off. He doesn't think, oh no, I'm going to have to find some better sort of workmen here to do this. And nor does it derail Jesus' plan. It continues anyway. Why? That might seem counterintuitive. That might seem a bit crazy kind of thinking. Why wouldn't he get some better people on the job? It might seem very inglorious, really. But it shows that the only reason that his mission works, disciples, making disciples, is because of who Jesus is, not the quality and the skill and the talent and the wisdom of us. Our very weakness points to Jesus' strength and sufficiency. And so, because of that, verse 19, he tells them, and he tells us here, go therefore. What's the therefore? Saying go because of all authority in heaven and earth being given to me. Go therefore and make disciples. Calls for a response to reproduce, to go and to make other disciples. And it's important to say that the word go there as well it's not go therefore as in, from this point forward, now think of it this way. It's a specific way of saying go from one place to another place to make disciples. Make a journey in from one place to another. He says go to all nations, to make disciples of all nations here. And actually the word is peoples, all different kinds of people, all different kinds of cultures and subcultures. It's not just about people from different nations. It's from people within different kind of groups within society too. Go to everyone to share a message. So where do we go? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be on a plane, but it might be from one group of people into another group of people to go and to tell them about Jesus and to show them what it looks like to live in light of his grace. Go to all people. And then gives two commands here: to baptize them as a sign of the covenant sort of people of God, and it's a sign of a unification with God, being united with him through baptism. We won't talk about exactly how to do that just now. That's a conversation for another day, but he gives that conversation of baptizing them. And secondly, verse 20, teaching them. And literally the original language there is saying learning them, teaching them, learning them to observe all that I've commanded. And think about this. How do we teach something that's inherently actually, practical about a way of life? If I used to sort of teach a couple of kids guitar, I was never that sort of good. So I always say there's going to be a certain point pretty soon where you need a better teacher than me. But how do you do that? Well, it's no good me just kind of giving them a massive sort of fat sort of booklet of theory. Well, there you go. If you can kind of read all of that That'll be all you need to know. You'll be able to be a great guitar player. It's practical. They need to see what it looks like. They need to have a guitar in their hand and to feel it and to hold it and to understand how it kind of works. And they need to watch somebody else do it. So, oh, okay, so that's how you put your hands there. And why do you do that and not that? You need to see it, and you need to have a go at it and things as well. It's no good. You don't become a master musician by just reading a book on it, or at least, I don't think anybody does. Maybe there's that one exception to the rule. I think for most people, you need to actually feel it. You need to play it. You need to have a go. You need to learn through making mistakes. And it's exactly the same for us here. Teaching them to observe all that I've commanded. We need to come alongside one another in everyday life. We need to bring those who don't know Jesus yet alongside us in everyday life to see what life looks like as a follower of Jesus, not just to learn things about him. Making disciples is the goal, and discipleship in everyday life is the vehicle through which we do it. But Jesus is the source and the cause of the growth within us and within those who don't know Jesus yet. So everyday discipleship is the thing that underpins it. It's the foundation. There's some underwhelming results with those disciples and with us too. There's this call to multiplication, and lastly, there's a certain graduation. You might be forgiven for thinking, how can I be confident at all that I'm going to make it to the end? How can I be confident in that? I worry that I'm just not going to make it, that at some point I'm going to fail. When I first became a Christian, a minister who went on to be a mentor for me wrote me a letter. And he wrote partly about his own experience of becoming Christian. We were both sons of ministers, so I think, he thought, well, I'm going to reach out to Dom and sort of encourage him because we had a few things in common. And one of the things he was saying in the letter was, do you know, Dom, when I first became a Christian, I worried that maybe I wouldn't be able to keep it up. He had been, of all the sort of children, I guess, the slightly more rebellious one. So his worry was, will I at some point, just make a mess of things and let God down and let other people down and just be a really bad witness to people? He said, it was only after a while that I realized it wasn't about me keeping anything up, but the gospel was about Jesus keeping me up. And he passed that on because I guess he suspected, and probably rightly so, that I might also have the same kind of worry of thinking, what if I just make a mess of things? And what if I don't make it to the end? But it's not about us keeping anything up. It's about Jesus keeping us up. That's how we can be confident that there's a certain graduation awaiting us. And yet here, even just in this last verse here, the second half of verse 20 there's no wasted words with Jesus here. He actually introduces, in the very last sort of part of the sentence there, a brand new idea. So that this gospel actually ends with a brand new idea right at the end there. He says, and behold, it's normally used at the end of a sort of section of narrative of story to draw attention now to something new. And he's doing it right at the end there. He's a lot like Columbo. If you ever watched an episode of Columbo, you know how every single one goes, that it's the same formula, that he comes back just right at the end with just one more thing. And suddenly it all unravels of what's really happened. You thought that he had no clue, and just now it all happens. Well, it's a similar thing that's going on here. And behold, he says, I am with you. The hope of this journey of relearning all of life in light of the hope of the gospel is that Jesus is with us. Because you, like me, might have been worried otherwise. How do I know that I'm going to make it to the end? I know my track record. I'm not particularly confident. Behold, I'm with you. And notice what he does here as well. Look, I'm with you, present tense, right now. I'm with you there now. I'm with you always. I'm going to continue to be with you, present and then continuous. He's with us now, but he'll stay with us. And then finally, to the end of the age. He'll always be with us. He's with us. He'll stay with us. He'll always be with us. That's the hope. There's the godly confidence we ought to have. False confidence is wrong and is unhealthy and unhelpful. But a godly confidence, a healthy confidence, is built upon who Jesus is and what he's doing. That he's with us, he'll stay with us, he'll always be with us. This godly confidence comes not in our own capability, not at all, but in the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. We can be confident in our graduation, in making it to the end, receiving all the promises of the gospel there, because of Jesus, because of who he is. And so it calls me, again, not to perfection, but to increased dependence, to rely on him. If it's all in his strength and in who he is, then the call isn't to me to try harder, to always say the right thing, to always be in the right place, to always do the right thing, to always put on the right display. No, the call is be increasingly dependent on Jesus, relying on him and looking to him. And what it will do is it will change the way I think and the way I feel and love and the way I act too. But the goal isn't perfectionism. The goal is dependency on Jesus. And even as we're trying to make disciples of those who don't know Jesus yet, often the struggle can be, what if I get something wrong? Kind of give them a really bad witness. Not that I'm encouraging you to be a bad witness, okay, so hear this the right way, I'm not, but is what non-Christians need to see somebody desperately trying to put on a religious performance of always doing the right thing, saying the right thing? No. A constant white-knuckle ride? No. What they need to see is somebody whose life is dependent and relying upon Jesus. And so actually there's an element of your witnessing which actually needs to be, willing to be vulnerable and to be open about, oh yeah, here's some of the ways I fail, by the way. And here's where I'm really hoping that Jesus and trusting that Jesus is going to help me with this, whatever it may be. I find it hard to be patient with my kids. And you know what? I'm realizing that actually if I just depend on me, just trying to work better at that, really limited results. Sometimes I get it right, but I find at some point I always fail. But instead, what I'm doing is I'm looking to the model and to the pattern of Jesus to shape the way I think, so that I would be different. I'm looking to Jesus, who's so patient with me, with all of my failings and all of my failings and my doubt, even when I say I follow him, and even after he's done all these things for me. I'm looking to that to encourage me and to inspire me and to change me. Or perhaps I worry about finances. And, rather than just trying to say to myself, don't worry, what I'm trying to do is remind myself of all that Jesus has given to me and all the ways in which he's provided for me before and all the ways in which everything that he's always enabled me to give him through being able to work or whatever else was because of him. And that if I hadn't had him providing that and enabling that with me, I wouldn't have had anything, and that I can trust his provision, that he's a good father. Jesus tells a story about saying, if you know how to give your kids good gifts, he says, which one of you would give your kids a snake? No one would. You would give good gifts. And there's a sting, because he said, look, if you, though you're evil, know how to give good gifts to your kids, well, how much more does God the Father know how to give good gifts to his kids? Do you see the difference? That what I'm trying to represent to people isn't moralism, really, with a bit of Jesus. I'm just trying really, really hard to always get things right. And I never want to tell you when I'm wrong, because I don't want you to think that we ever get things wrong as Christians. No, there's a huge difference to say, actually, Joe, I'm on a journey and I'm still a long way kind of from the end. But here's what's I'm using, to look to depend on, to rely on, and to reshape me and to transform me in his image. Called to be learners of Jesus in all of life. And perhaps like me, you'll have that sort of sense of feeling, if you were to get a report card back now, that perhaps it would have those sort of fairly infamous words of could do better on there at some point. Some sort of sense that, I feel I could just do that bit better. I'm going to encourage you now, by way of response, to maybe join me in this prayer at home where you are. We'll keep you on mute just for the sake of the clarity of the audio, and because I don't know if you can hear the kids in the background for me and stuff as well, that might just be multiplied in other homes too. But you can find the words of this up on the service order, and I'll try to speak slow enough, that you can follow along as well. I hope I won't be reading it too quickly. Let's turn to our gracious and loving Heavenly Father in prayer as we recognize our weakness and recognize our need and ask that He would be all that we need. We confess, loving and good Father, that in response to your loving kindness, we have rebelled. We've treated you as though you're not good, as though your will may do us harm, and as though our will would be better. We confess that we've thought we've known better. We've gone our own way, and we've forsaken your loving kindness. We've searched for hope and strength in other accolades, places, positions, things, and people. We've given our hearts to counterfeit gods who've given nothing but broken promises. And now empty, weary, wandering, we return to you, our hope, our strength, our song. Father of lights, lover of our souls, giver of all good gifts, you are our good Father, and all that is good, right, and perfect is found in you. May you help us to turn our hearts, our minds, and our souls to rest in you, to trust in your all-sufficient grace, and place our soul's strength and delight in you. Father, help us to love you with all our heart, all our strength, and all our mind. May we do all trusting in your love, clinging to you, depending in your free grace and your glory. Amen. And then listen to these words of assurance here just before we sing our closing song together in a few moments. This is Jesus praying to his Father, praying for us in those last moments before he's arrested in the garden. He says, all mine are yours and yours are mine, and I'm glorified in them. And I'm no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, keep them in your name, which you've given me, that they may be one even as we are one. While I was with them, I kept them in your name, which you've given me. I've guarded them, and not one of them has been lost except the son of destruction, that the scripture might be fulfilled. But now I'm coming to you. And these things I speak in the world, that they may have my joy fulfilled in themselves. I've given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I've sent them into the world. And for their sake, I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth. The hope this morning here is, and I hope that you're reassured as you hear these words of Jesus praying for you, praying what you really need, not just what you think you need. What I think I need and what I really need is often different things. Here is Jesus praying for what I really need here. And he is praying that the Father would keep us, so that I don't have to just constantly white knuckle grabbing on as tight as I can to hope that I'll keep the performance up and I'll keep pleasing God and not let him down. No, my hope is there is a good and loving Heavenly Father in heaven who is keeping me. And my response is to depend on him, to turn to him, to rely on him, to rely on who he is.